You were not supposed to feel this confused if everything you were taught was true. Not a little confused. This deep, quiet kind of confusion that follows you even when you're doing everything right. You pray, but something feels distant. You believe, but something feels incomplete. You obey, but something doesn't move. And the most unsettling part is this: no one around you seems to question it. They repeat the same phrases, the same ideas, the same explanations. And if you feel something is off, you're told to just have more faith. But what if the problem is not your faith? What if the problem is what your faith has been built on? Because not everything that sounds spiritual is true. Not everything that is repeated in churches is accurate, and not everything that feels comforting actually leads to alignment. Some of it is wrong, not completely false. That would be easy to reject. Slightly distorted, close enough to truth to sound right, but far enough to mislead you. And those are the most dangerous lies, because they don't push you away from God. They keep you close, but misaligned. And misalignment is harder to detect than rebellion, because you still look faithful. You still feel sincere, but nothing flows the way it should. And if you don't confront that, you'll spend years trying harder, without ever realizing you were building on something unstable. There are lies that don't look like lies. They look like teachings, like wisdom, like maturity. And they shape how you see God, how you see yourself, how you respond to everything. And once they take root, they don't just influence you, they define your limits. They decide what you expect, what you accept, what you tolerate. And if those limits are wrong, your entire direction will be too. The first lie sounds humble. It sounds safe. It sounds almost correct. You've heard it so many times that it feels unquestionable. God just wants you to be comfortable and happy. It sounds good. It sounds kind. It feels like something you want to believe, but it quietly removes something essential, because comfort does not produce growth, and happiness is not the measure of alignment. If your goal becomes comfort, you will avoid anything that challenges you. If your goal becomes happiness, you will reject anything that stretches you. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to resist the very things that were meant to transform you. You start interpreting discomfort as something wrong instead of something necessary. You start asking, "Why is this happening to me?" instead of asking, "What is this producing in me?" And that shift changes everything. Because now, instead of moving through difficulty, you start avoiding it. And when you avoid it, you stay the same. This is why some people feel stuck for years, not because nothing is happening, but because they've been taught to measure everything by how it feels. And feelings are unstable. They change. They fluctuate. They respond to circumstances. But alignment is not based on how something feels. It's based on what it produces. And if you've been chasing comfort, you've been moving away from growth without even realizing it. The second lie is even more dangerous because it sounds spiritual. If it's God's will, it will happen without effort. It sounds like trust. It sounds like surrender. But it quietly removes responsibility, because it teaches you to wait instead of move, to observe instead of act, to hope instead of align. And over time, this creates passivity. You start believing that if something is meant for you, it will come regardless of what you do. So you stop preparing, you stop responding, you stop taking steps when clarity appears, and that delay becomes your pattern. But here's the truth most people don't want to hear. Many things are available, but not automatic. They require participation. They require movement. They require obedience in real time. And when you sit still waiting for something to happen on its own, you miss the moment where it was supposed to be activated through you. This is where people lose years, not because nothing was available, but because they were waiting for what required action. And by the time they realize it, the moment has passed. and they call it not meant to be. But it wasn't that. It was missed. The third lie feels like protection. Avoid anything that challenges your peace. It sounds wise. It sounds healthy. It sounds like boundaries, but it creates something subtle. Fragility, because real peace is not the absence of challenge. It's stability within it. And if you build your life around avoiding anything that disturbs you, you will never develop strength. You will become dependent on controlled environments. You will only feel stable when everything around you is predictable. And the moment something unexpected happens, everything inside you shakes, because your peace was never internal. It was conditional. And conditional peace breaks under pressure. This is why some people collapse under situations that should have strengthened them, not because they are weak, but because they were taught to avoid pressure instead of grow through it. And what you avoid does not disappear. It waits, it returns. And when it returns, it feels heavier, because now you're less prepared to face it. And that's how cycles form, not from what you face, from what you keep avoiding. The fourth lie sounds like grace, but it quietly removes transformation. You don't need to change. God accepts you as you are. It feels comforting. It feels freeing. It feels like a release from pressure, but it leaves something unfinished, because acceptance was never meant to eliminate change. It was meant to begin it. And when that part is removed, you stay where you are while convincing yourself you're growing. You stop confronting patterns that need to be broken. You stop challenging habits that keep repeating. You stop questioning parts of yourself that don't align, because you've been told you're already fine. And over time, that creates stagnation, not obvious stagnation, subtle. You feel like you're moving, but nothing is actually shifting. You hear more, you understand more, but your life doesn't reflect more, and that disconnect becomes normal. You start thinking growth is just awareness, but awareness without change is just information. And information does not transform you. Action does. Alignment does. Correction does. This is why some people know everything, but remain the same. Because they replaced transformation with comfort, and comfort cannot produce what requires change. The fifth lie hides inside something people call faith. If you have enough faith, you won't struggle. It sounds powerful, it sounds inspiring, but it creates something dangerous. It makes struggle feel like failure, so when things get hard, you start questioning yourself. You think something is wrong with you. You think your faith is not strong enough. And instead of moving through the struggle, you start trying to eliminate it. You start resisting what you should be learning from. But struggle is not the opposite of faith. It is part of it. It reveals what is real. It exposes what is weak. It forces growth that comfort never will. And when you try to avoid struggle, you avoid the very process that builds strength. This is why some people remain fragile, not because they lack belief, but because they were taught to reject difficulty instead of grow through it. And what you reject cannot shape you. It only returns stronger. The sixth lie feels responsible. Stay in control of your life. Don't rely too much on anything. It sounds balanced, it sounds mature, but it quietly replaces dependence with control. You start planning everything, managing everything, anticipating everything. You rely on what you can see, what you can measure, what you can predict. And over time, you stop leaving space for anything beyond your control. You stop trusting beyond your understanding. You stop stepping into things that require risk. And that limits everything, because what you control is always smaller than what is possible. And when control becomes your default, you close yourself off from anything that requires trust. This is why some people never step into what they are capable of. Not because it's not available, but because it doesn't fit inside what they can control, and they choose control over expansion every time. The seventh lie sounds like patience. Just wait. Everything will happen in time. It feels calm, it feels safe, but it creates delay because it teaches you to stay passive when you should be moving. You sit back, you wait. You tell yourself the timing will come. But timing is not something you observe. It's something you align with. There are moments that require action, and if you miss them, they don't repeat the same way. And when you keep waiting instead of responding, you lose those moments. And over time, waiting becomes your habit. You wait for clarity instead of acting on what you already know. You wait for confirmation instead of moving on what is already clear. And that delay becomes the reason nothing changes, not because it wasn't meant to happen, but because you never stepped into it. The eighth lie is the one that almost no one questions because it sounds so spiritual. Everything that happens is God's will. It feels like surrender. It feels like acceptance, but it removes discernment. Because if everything is automatically labeled as God's will, you stop questioning what is actually aligned and what is not. You stop correcting what needs to be corrected. You stop resisting what should be resisted. You accept things you were never meant to accept, and that creates confusion. Because not everything that happens is something you should keep. Some things are allowed, but not intended. Some things happen, but are meant to be confronted. And if you treat everything the same, you lose the ability to respond correctly. And without correct response, nothing changes. You just adapt to what should have been challenged. And adaptation without discernment leads to stagnation, not because nothing is happening, but because everything is being accepted without question. And once that becomes your mindset, you stop shaping your direction. You just live inside whatever happens. And that is not alignment, that is drift. The ninth lie is the one that sounds the most spiritual on the surface, but quietly removes power from your life. As long as your intentions are good, that's what matters. It feels right, it feels fair, it feels like something that should be true. But it replaces responsibility with comfort, because intentions do not produce results. Actions do. Alignment does. You can intend to change, intend to grow, intend to do what is right, and still remain exactly where you are if nothing follows those intentions. And over time, this creates a dangerous illusion. You start feeling like you're moving forward because your intentions are sincere. You feel like you're progressing because you want the right things. But your life reflects what you actually do, not what you mean to do. And that gap becomes normal. You begin to justify inaction because your heart feels right. But your heart without movement does not change your direction. This is why some people stay in the same place for years while believing they're on the right path. Not because they don't care, but because they replaced action with intention. And intention alone cannot build anything. The 10th lie hides inside something that feels like protection. Don't judge anything, just accept everything. It sounds kind, it sounds peaceful, it sounds like maturity, but it removes clarity because discernment requires you to see things as they are, not just accept them as they come. And when you stop distinguishing what aligns and what doesn't, everything blends together. You lose sharpness, you lose direction, you stop correcting what needs correction, you stop separating what should not stay in your life. And over time, your standards shift, not all at once. Quietly, what used to feel wrong becomes less noticeable. What used to stand out becomes normal. And once your standard changes, your decisions follow, because you don't act outside of what you consider acceptable. And if what is acceptable has been lowered, your entire direction adjusts with it. This is why some people slowly drift without realizing it. Not because they chose something completely different, but because they stopped defining what is actually right. And without that definition, everything becomes optional. The 11th lie feels like humility. Put yourself last in everything. It sounds noble, it sounds selfless, but it can become destructive when misunderstood because it leads to neglect. You start ignoring your own growth, your own responsibility, your own development. You focus outward so much that you lose structure within. And over time, that creates imbalance. You become drained. You become inconsistent. You lose clarity about your own direction, and that affects everything because you cannot give what you have not built. You cannot lead from emptiness. You cannot stay aligned if you are constantly neglecting your own foundation. And what looks like humility turns into instability. This is why some people burn out while trying to do everything right. Not because they are wrong, but because they misunderstood what was required of them. Balance is not selfish, it is necessary. Without it, nothing remains stable. And when nothing is stable, everything begins to collapse slowly. The 12th lie is the one that holds all the others in place. It sounds harmless, it sounds simple, it sounds like something you've believed your entire life. You have time. Not urgency, not now, later, eventually, when things settle, when you're ready, when it feels right. And that belief is what keeps everything from changing, because it removes urgency, it allows delay, it justifies inaction. You tell yourself you'll deal with things later, you'll fix what you already see, you'll correct what you already know is off. But later never arrives the way you expect, because what you delay becomes harder to confront. It becomes more familiar, more comfortable, more integrated into your life. And the longer it stays, the more it feels like part of you. And once it feels like part of you, you stop trying to change it. Not because you can't, but because you don't feel the urgency anymore. And without urgency, nothing moves. This is where most people stay, not because they don't know, but because they believe they have time. And that belief quietly keeps everything exactly where it is. And this is the point where everything either becomes real or stays theoretical, because now you see it, not just one lie, several. And they're not distant ideas anymore. They're patterns. They're things you've repeated, things you've justified, things that quietly shaped how you think and how you respond. And once you see that, you can't go back to not knowing. You can only decide what you're going to do with it. And this is where most people step back, not because they disagree, but because they realize what it will cost to change it. Because once you remove these lies, you lose the comfort they gave you. You lose the excuses they allowed. You lose the explanations that made everything feel easier to accept. And suddenly, everything becomes more direct, more clear, more demanding. You can no longer say, "This is just how it is." You can no longer hide behind, "It will happen in time." You can no longer avoid what you already know needs to be confronted. And that level of clarity is uncomfortable because it puts responsibility back in your hands, not pressure. Responsibility, the understanding that what happens next is not random. It is shaped by what you choose to do with what you now understand. And that changes how you move. Because now delay is no longer neutral. It becomes a decision. Inaction becomes a decision. Ignoring becomes a decision. And once you realize that, everything becomes sharper. You start noticing your own patterns in real time. You catch yourself thinking the same way, responding the same way, avoiding the same things. And that awareness gives you a choice in the moment, not later, not in theory, in real time. And that is where change actually begins, not in understanding, in interruption. The moment you stop a pattern while it's happening, the moment you choose differently while it still feels uncomfortable. That's where direction shifts. And most people don't do that. They understand, they agree, they feel something. But when the moment comes, they fall back into what is familiar, because familiarity feels easier than change, even when it keeps you stuck. And this is why nothing changes for them. Not because they lack knowledge, but because they don't interrupt the pattern when it appears. And patterns don't break themselves. They continue until something stronger replaces them. And that something stronger is not emotion. It's decision repeated consistently. That's what creates a new direction. Not one time, not occasionally. Every time the old pattern appears. And at first, that feels unnatural. It feels forced. It feels like effort. But over time, something shifts. The new response becomes easier. The old pattern becomes less automatic, and eventually it stops being your default. And that's when real change becomes visible, not because something external happened, but because something internal stabilized. And once that stabilizes, everything else begins to align around it. Your thinking becomes clearer, your reactions become more controlled, your direction becomes consistent, and consistency is what produces results, not intensity, not temporary effort, stability over time. And once you reach that point, you stop feeling like you're trying to change. You realize you already have. And that's the difference between effort and transformation. Effort feels like struggle. Transformation feels like alignment. And alignment removes friction. It simplifies decisions. It clarifies direction. It makes things that used to feel complicated, obvious. And that's what these lies have been blocking. Not knowledge, not belief. Clarity. Because when your foundation is slightly off, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. And no amount of effort fixes instability. Only correction does. And now you have that opportunity. Not later, not eventually, right now. Because this level of clarity does not stay this sharp if you ignore it. It fades, it softens, it becomes less urgent. And once it loses urgency, it loses impact. And that's how people return to the same patterns they just recognized, not because they chose to, but because they didn't act while it was clear. And that's the moment that matters most, not what you understand, what you do next. And this is where everything either becomes permanent or disappears like it was never there. Because right now, you're not lacking understanding. You're not missing clarity. You're not confused. You see it. You felt it. You recognized patterns that were invisible before. And that moment is rare, but it doesn't stay. It fades if it's not anchored. And most people lose it right here, not because they reject it, because they don't act on it fast enough. They leave this moment with intention, not with decision. They think about it, they replay it, they tell themselves they'll start changing things later. But later is where clarity weakens. Later is where excuses return. Later is where what felt obvious becomes optional. And once it becomes optional, it doesn't get done. That's how cycles survive. Not through force, through delay. So if something stood out to you, if one of those lies felt personal, if you recognized yourself in it even for a second, that is not something to think about. That is something to act on immediately. Because that recognition is not random, it's precise. It's showing you exactly where your direction has been shaped without your awareness. And once you see it, you have a responsibility to respond to it. Not out of pressure, out of alignment. Because every lie you keep becomes a limit you live under. It defines what you expect, what you accept, what you tolerate. And as long as it stays, it continues shaping your life in the same direction. You don't need more information. You don't need more understanding. You need interruption. A clear decision that something is no longer allowed to stay. And that decision has to be followed by action immediately. Not a big action, a precise one. If it's a thought pattern, catch it the next time it appears and cut it off. If it's a behavior, stop it at the moment it starts. If it's something you've been delaying, move on it before the day ends. Because action is what locks clarity into place. Without it, everything you just understood dissolves back into routine. And routine is what keeps everything the same. This is why some people listen to the same truths over and over, and nothing changes. Not because the truth is weak, because their response is delayed. And delayed response kills momentum. It breaks the connection between awareness and action. And once that connection is broken, nothing moves. So don't break it. Keep it intact. Act while it's still clear. Decide while it still feels uncomfortable. Because discomfort is the signal that something real is shifting. And if you move through that instead of avoiding it, you create something most people never build. Stability, not emotional stability, structural, a kind of internal alignment that doesn't depend on how you feel, a kind of clarity that doesn't fade when things get difficult, a kind of direction that doesn't change based on circumstances. And once that is built, everything else follows naturally. You don't have to force change. You don't have to chase results. You don't have to constantly question where you're going, because when your foundation is corrected, your direction becomes consistent, and consistency produces results over time, not instantly, but inevitably. And that's the difference between people who keep starting over and people who actually move forward. One keeps reacting to moments. The other builds something that holds them steady through them. So decide what this becomes. Not just another message, not just something you heard and agreed with, something you used, something you acted on, something that actually changed how you move starting now. Because if you do that, you won't need to search for answers the same way anymore. You won't feel stuck in the same patterns. You won't feel like something is always slightly off. You'll know why things are different, because you removed what was shaping your direction without your awareness. And once that is gone, everything becomes clearer, not easier, clearer. And clarity is what allows you to move without hesitation, to decide without overthinking, to respond without delay. And that's where real progress begins, not when you know more, when you stop allowing what kept you where you were.